Back to school. COVID-19 has shuttered schools from daycares to universities. But when and how will they return in the fall? Kate Hardiman, education and legal specialist, joins us to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. Continuing our conversation tonight in our Understanding COVID-19 mini-series, we shift our attention to the classroom. Across the country, schools from daycares to universities have been shuttered in the wake of stay-at-home orders from the COVID-19 pandemic. Will these schools open back up? How will they open back up? And what is the toll on the finances, on our students, on our teachers? Kate Hardiman is an education and legal specialist who has covered this issue, or covered education, I say, at length, and she joins us here tonight. Kate, welcome to Face the Issues. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
It's good to have you. Before we jump in, let me just give the viewers a bit of an introduction to you. You are currently a legal fellow with Cooper and Kirk, a firm in DC. You've covered this issue, or I should say education issues, for the Washington Examiner. You've written for a number of different journals. You've been with ACE, the Alliance for Catholic Education. What I love about the perspective you're going to bring tonight is not only have you dealt with this as a policy issue, you've dealt with this as a teacher. You've been in the classroom. You understand where our teachers and our students come from. As full disclosure to our viewers, you have done work for me in a number of different capacities over the years. My good friends know that I owe much of my success to you, and you've done incredibly good work for us at the Little Group and as well as for me personally. You've been a Publius Fellow with Claremont Institute. You have a very, very long, successful resume, not to mention you've talked about education issues on a variety of different media outlets. So I want to set that for our viewers so they know that we're talking to the expert here, and pulling from all of that experience. Okay, I want to start with a 30,000-foot level approach to this. Obviously, all the schools have shuttered. We're talking, K through 12 through higher ed. Let's start on the higher ed end. The move to online schooling in higher ed, a lot of drastic adjustments for colleges, for universities, and we've seen the switch to pass-fail grading. We've seen plummeting enrollment numbers. When you look at this as a large picture, where do you think the greatest impact comes for our colleges and universities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest impact is that colleges are going to be forced to do what the rest of the country's businesses do on a routine basis, and that is to make responsible fiscal decisions. So I think, high level, colleges are really going to be forced to rethink their business models.
Let's go on and talk about that. And you've said this is what all businesses have to do, business owners, from small businesses to large businesses. Christina Paxton, who's the president of Brown University, recently wrote a piece in the New York Times where she essentially argued that colleges and universities will not be able to sustain themselves if they don't reopen soon. She was pushing a fall 2020 return. How accurate and I know you've written about that, and we'll get to that in a moment, but how accurate do you think Paxton's analysis is? How quickly do these schools need to reopen?
I mean, colleges are definitely balancing the trade-off, as is all of society, that, they're balancing safety and their own financial stability. It's been widely remarked that colleges cannot afford not to bring students back in the fall. In other words, their business models will just collapse if they don't bring students back. Colleges are concerned that students don't want to pay full tuition for online classes, and therefore that students will, decide to take a gap year or decline to enroll entirely. So I think, they're in a catch-22 because they need to bring students back for their own fiscal health, but they also are really afraid of the public health consequences. And I mean, there's been one system, the University of California system, recently announced that they're not going to bring students back. And just reading, the factors that went into that decision, they said it would cost them $25 million a week to give the testing necessary to protect the students. So, I mean,
Wow.
that analysis shows just how deeply colleges are thinking about these issues. And I mean, they're already facing a fiscal loss for having to refund room and board last semester to students.
Mm-hmm.
So where is that 25 million going to come from for, COVID testing? I don't see it happening. I mean, I think best case scenario, schools go to some sort of hybrid model where they have large lecture classes online and then some small classes meeting in person. However, I will say that older professors still might not feel comfortable with that. And that's something that, schools will really have to grapple with. Maybe they'll have the professors Zoom into the class and all of the students sitting there. I mean, that could be a solution. But I think above all, colleges will have to rethink their business models and really decide, how are we going to structure ourselves so that we're solvent and we don't have to keep raising tuition year after year, because at a certain point, people just aren't going to pay for it.
Yeah. It's funny that you brought that up. I've been in a number of these conversations in higher ed where they're looking at the future, and some people are saying, no, we're going to do online school as the model. Others are saying, good luck trying to teach biolab through Zoom. You have to be on campus for labs. And then there's always talk about some kind of hybrid system where, to your point, we'll do bio lecture via internet. We'll do lab on campus for a limited number of students, and a lot of conversations kind of surrounding that. Kate, you've written a piece in the Washington Examiner, not directly a response to President Paxton, but addressing some of those same ideas. And you suggested here already that perhaps these different looks at, should we go online, should we do some kind of remote system or some kind of hybrid system, is really more of a bandage to a larger problem, and that we need to rethink the system. What makes you say that we need to rethink the system? You mentioned earlier the idea that schools are tuition's only bringing in some of the money for the schools. What's is wrong with the system as it is now?
Yeah, I mean, I would say two things. So tuition is only some of the money. A large portion of the money comes from room and board, student fees, which are growing by the year, and then also revenue from sports teams. And so I would say tuition on average is about 40% of schools' fiscal intake. So if they're putting classes online, they have to commit to losing that other 60%. However, there are abilities for colleges to cut costs so that 60% is not so grave of an impact. So, for example, administrative staff is extremely bloated in higher education. And no, it has been, and it has been growing for many years. So, I mean, just a small example is that the University of California spent $80 million between 2012 and 2015, increasing their administrative staff. Wow. It was an increase of 28%. So, I mean, referencing that system again, they know that that's not going to be sustainable in the long term if they can't have kids back to campus. And I think in general, a lot more money had been devoted to instruction, but then sometime around the mid-2000s, there was this shift and colleges started hiring more administrators, and now there are more offices and more coordinators and more people to run student activities departments. So that piece of higher ed's budget has continued to grow. And they've basically had no reason to take a hard look at their balance sheet and say, do we really need all of these? I mean, it sounds harsh because those are people's jobs, but any other business is forced to look at their balance sheet and make those decisions about what is, truly going toward instruction, like professors and facilities, and then what is not.
Right, especially in a time like this, where cuts are being made. That's a conversation every business is having. And there's a lot of conversation as well right now in the higher ed space with everything online. You're seeing a lot of universities or private schools that tend to be pricier. They're starting to offer online courses cheaper. A lot of students starting to pivot toward perhaps let me do a semester at a community college if I'm online anyway, and I can't enjoy necessarily the campus life of, say, University of Notre Dame, your alma mater. Let me go somewhere that I can just go cheap if I'm going to be at home anyway. What kind of impact do you see this having on universities, maybe not just in the fall, but long term? I know you've advocated this idea that we need to change the system. Do you think this COVID-19 pandemic will be the trigger for that change?
I'm hopeful that it will be. And I mean, what you mentioned is interesting. So students staying closer to home. I could also see an outcome where students forego any sort of higher education altogether and enter a sort of white collar apprenticeship. So we see this happening already in many European, especially Scandinavian countries. We tend to think of apprenticeships in the US as just being for people who want to go into trades, such as plumbing or being an electrician. However, a lot of other countries actually have white collar apprenticeships where you are a legal apprentice or, a business apprentice, an accounting apprentice. So I wonder if we will see more of a shift toward those types of paths for students, and if we'll have the sort of system that allows that to be viable. Case in point, a few, I know, tech companies have already begun waiving the college degree requirement. They will hire people as long as they're qualified and they have the requisite programming skills. So I think that's another shift we could see.
That's fascinating. Kate, don't go away. I want to continue this conversation. We're going to go to break first. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Kate, thank you again for being with us. I want to shift our conversation now from higher ed to K through 12. Like we said earlier, the entire spectrum of the education system is being impacted by COVID. All of society is being impacted by COVID, if we're honest. The K through 12, is it different? Is the impact on these schools different than what we're seeing in higher ed? Is it the same? What's your assessment of that?
I think it's different. And I mean, speaking as a former teacher, I taught 9th through 12th graders. And it's a totally different ballgame when you tell an 18-year-old to sit in front of a computer and learn all day versus telling a 13-year-old to do the same thing. I mean, I really feel for K-12 teachers who have just been launched into this era of remote learning. It is not easy. Many schools were not prepared. Many districts were not prepared. And we should not fault them for that. Now, there were some varied responses, and some responses were just simply amazing, and we can get into that in a bit. But I think big picture, this is a different ballgame than higher ed, and their K-12 schools are facing a different calculus in terms of returning in the fall as well.
Okay, it's interesting. Let's go to what schools are doing well, what schools aren't doing well. What are you seeing that has been successful? And let me add to that, are we seeing a divide down the lines of public schools, private schools, charter schools, or is this kind of a hodgepodge? It really depends on the school.
So I would actually say it depends on the state. So it divides, interestingly, you would think, and my biases, I was a public school student, but I taught in the private school sector. So we would tend to think that private schools may be more prepared for something like this because they are, on average, more resourced. This actually hasn't been the case. So it really broke down based on states. So for example, Florida had an amazing response. Florida has an extremely strong public school accountability system and also private school choice system. Their governor acted very quickly, mobilized to get 32,000 laptops in the hands of students across the state. and just worked really hard. Florida actually already has a statewide virtual school. So through that statewide virtual school, they were able to provide training to teachers across the state about how to teach on a virtual platform. Now, the corollary to that is a place like Los Angeles, who, a month into the crisis was unable to account for 1/3 of their high school students. They couldn't verify that they had checked in online. It seems like it was just a total mess. They had no idea where their kids were, if they were safe, if they were fed. So there are various responses. Obviously, another big issue has been access to broadband. And one of my favorite, most innovative responses to that issue was South Carolina. They mobilized school buses and reconfigured them as Wi-Fi hotspots, and they put them in low-income neighborhoods so that students could access the internet and do their schoolwork. So, I think really there have been some truly amazing, innovative responses, and we'll certainly need to see more of those going forward. And I think even schools would be well to do that during this summer, because students, it's predicted, have already lost some of their learning from this remote period in the school year. So how do we avoid that summer melt that tends to happen anyway, to get more learning into the hands of students this summer?
Yeah. Oh, that's very creative. South Carolina with these Wi-Fi hotspots. Kate, let me ask you, along those lines of instruction, when we look at curriculum and instruction, how is this going to be impacted heading into the fall? You've talked about a lot of the inability perhaps to finish curriculums. State standards dictate so much of how public schools operate in our country from state to state. Are these standards still being met? Are we falling behind these standards, which would not be anyone's fault per se in this situation, but how are schools going to handle that come the fall?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Most states have actually waived their standards and testing requirements for at least the spring. It remains to be seen if more action will be taken for that in the fall. I think the bigger issue is not so much to focus on whether or not we have the standards or we waive the standards. I think what districts should really be focusing on, and just schools in general, is equipping teachers. So sometimes we look at the standards, but the standards, are important, but really we need to focus on each individual classroom. And I think the best and most effective way to do that is to have teachers who are equipped to teach virtually and have some sort of mentoring with a teacher who knows how to do it. And I think an important thing to remember is that virtual schooling shouldn't and does not have to be a replica of in-person schooling. So I've heard anecdotally from some teacher friends about, different responses. So some teachers try to have their kids, at the computer all day, just as they would have them in a normal classroom all day.
Sure.
And that just doesn't make sense for a lot of children and a lot of adults. So a different response, and how we see the model shifting and becoming adaptable, is that teachers will assign work to students to be completed independently or in small groups over Zoom. And then the teachers will meet independently with the students or with their small group to actually have a tutoring session. And in that way, the education is a little bit more personalized, because the teacher is able to address one-on-one the child's needs.
That's fascinating. The innovation for a time like this is always fascinating to me. Let me ask you, and continuing that along those lines, one of the things that we say a lot is that your zip code, or you hear a lot, is that your zip code should not determine your quality of education. And obviously in public schooling, there's a discrepancy between people who grew up in more affluent areas. Both you and I are product of public high schools that are very well off and do very well academically, athletically. But a lot of our friends are not quite as fortunate. And a lot of the states provided a lot of programs, such as after-school programs and free lunch programs and things like this, that are now also out the window with the shutdown. badly between curriculum instruction and these other programs are these underprivileged districts or poorer districts being impacted, and how do we go about, what kind of solutions do we have going forward for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise that we see districts that are already under-resourced being the hardest hit, especially inner city districts. Some have been very good at marshaling, ways to still get children the meals they would be receiving at school. I know, right around the corner from me in Washington, D.C., public schools have been very effective at distributing food. So those needs are still being met in some areas, but it's absolutely true. And when, it comes time for states to reevaluate their budgets in the fall, as they most certainly will have to do, there will most likely be cuts to education. And I think it's the job of legislators to make sure that those cuts don't fall disproportionately on districts that are already cash strapped. But also legislators would be wise to expand the options of the parents and children attending those under-resourced schools. So school choice has a huge role to play in this. And we, as a society, need to focus on giving parents as many options as possible in the fall, especially because a number of families' financial situations may have changed. They may have to move. They may have, unforeseen changes to their situations. So I think providing families with the flexibility to direct their child's education is absolutely imperative. And to that end, the Department of Education recently created a grant program that incentivizes states and has, the opportunity for states to make innovative school choice programs, and then we'll give them grants of up to $50 million. So that's a great start, and states should begin looking into that immediately.
Kate, what do you say? I mean, the school choice debate, which we could do a whole nother episode on, the question of charter schools. One of the pushbacks is always, with charters, is some charters do great, and then some charters fall below the performance of the public schools. The idea of school choice is and with charters, then we're allocating money that is going to already cash-strapped public schools. And I'm sure we're going to hear the argument again that after COVID, this pandemic, we've cut budgets, the states cut education funding, the districts are short on their budgets. This is not the time to be allocating money for school choice or charter schools. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I think in many states, charter schools actually represent a cost savings to the state. So charter schools are able to more efficiently provide education than district schools, largely and in part due to the fact that they have fewer administrators. And they don't have unionized teachers, so that's a whole nother issue. But in general, where charter schools are allowed to operate, their per pupil funding is less than the average public school district in the state, far less. So allowing more of those options to open would actually help in terms of resource distribution. Moreover, there are empty seats in private schools, especially private parochial schools in inner cities. So expanding access to fill those empty seats would also relieve the burden on the public school district in terms of both students and resources. And there was a really interesting analysis recently by EdChoice, which is an education policy research group. And they found that if all of the students in private schools were suddenly dumped back into the public system because after COVID, their parents couldn't afford it anymore, it would basically just blow up all education budgets to the tune of some $3.3 trillion.
Oh, wow.
So we really need to make sure that we have students going the other way, which is from public to private and not from private to public, simply because their financial circumstances have changed.
Sure. That's great. Kate, thank you. Don't go away. We will be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Kate, thank you again for being here and for discussing these topics, especially for shining a light on the role that innovation is playing as we move forward in education. You've been the teacher, Kate. You've been working on these education policy issues for quite some time. What, if you could share some advice to the students today going through this, to the class of 2020, what would that be?
It's interesting, Sam. My brother is one of those seniors. So he graduates from the University of Notre Dame, my alma mater, this year. So to him and to all seniors, I would emphasize that more than ever, we owe it to one another to show both graciousness and gratitude. So you are right to be frustrated with decisions to move classes online and have your traditions canceled with a brief email. However, I think it's important that we try to express graciousness and gratitude toward the people who are making these decisions. So many tough decisions have been made over the past 3 months, and the country is collectively making a good faith effort to do the best that it can. But I think in the long run, the class of 2020 and all of us will come out of this for the better if we try to limit resentment and frustration and just approach everyone we meet with graciousness and gratitude for the work they're doing.
Great closing words. I could not agree more. Kate, thank you for that. Thank you again for joining us. That is all the time we have tonight. My thanks to Kate Hardiman for illuminating this topic for us. Join us again next week as we just continue our conversation on the impact of COVID-19. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.